Welcome to this rapid revision session on the Kent State shootings in 1970. This is a particularly shocking event because it involves American armed forces opening fire on American citizens on American soil. There were also some pretty shocking and famous and iconic images from this as well, but I've not always been able to include those because of the content filters that are on YouTube. But they are out there, and I'm sure that some of you who've had lessons on this will be familiar with them. So let's remind ourselves as to why students were against the Vietnam War. Student opposition was quite widespread. Around 8.5 million students were active in some form of anti-Vietnam War protest by 1970. Many young people rejected their parents' generation's views. The counterculture of music and sex, drugs and rock and roll rebelled against traditional views. Students opposed the war by burning their draft cards, by organising strikes, boycotts and protest marches, and they sometimes went further than this too. Student groups like Students for a Democratic Society got media attention, but they were a minority. They were mostly white and middle class though, and that meant that the media tended to give them attention. They were active throughout the war, but particularly in 1970 when Nixon expanded the war, and it's on this point that we come to the Kent State shootings. Some images that I will risk putting on, because they're not the goriest ones, are these. At the top we can see the firing line of American National Guard troops. Remember, these are not the same as the regular army, they're more like state troops, but they are soldiers nonetheless. We can see the gun smoke in front of them. Clearly they've just opened fire on campus. Underneath is one of the most famous images from that terrible day. It shows 15-year-old protester Mary Ann Vecchio screaming above the body of Jeffrey Miller, who's just been killed by the National Guard. So what on earth went wrong in the Kent State shootings? In 1970, a shocking event occurred at Kent State University, Ohio. US soldiers opened fire on US citizens on US soil. There is some lead up to it. On May 1st, 1970, violence between anti-war and pro-war students broke out. This was sparked by Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia, which anti-war students saw as an unwarranted expansion and which pro-war students tended to see as a necessary way of ending the war. On May 2nd, anti-war protesters ended up burning down the Officer Training Corps building. For them, this represented the army. On May 3rd, National Guard soldiers broke up demonstrations using tear gas. But then it's on May 4th that 2,000 to 3,000 protesters turned up, ignoring a ban on demonstrations. And it's at this point that tensions basically boil over into tragedy. The National Guard fired at the students with their M1 rifles. 4 were killed, 9 were wounded, and 2 of the dead were not even actually part of the protest. But once you shoot a rifle, that bullet is going a long way until it hits something. And sadly, it hit the students. Let's take a moment to review the victims of this terrible massacre. Alison Beth Krause, 1951 to 1970, died aged 19. Jeffrey Glenn Miller, 1950 to 1970, died aged 20. Sandra Lee Schuer, 1949 to 1970, died aged 20. And William Knox Schroeder, 1950 to 1970, aged only 19 when he died. So what was the reaction to this? Well, it's worth pointing out that the shootings at Kent State were shocking, but they weren't unique. This shows broken glass and bullet holes at Jackson State University. Here, 2 students, Philip Lafayette Gibbs and James Earl Green, also died under reasonably similar circumstances. So why didn't this get more attention? It's very similar to Kent State. Could it be that there were 2 victims rather than 4? Or could it be that, remember, this is still the era of civil rights? Jackson State was a predominantly black university, and both victims were black Americans. And at this time, remember, the media didn't always give them so much attention. But the victims of Kent State and Jackson State will be remembered, and they are remembered. And even at the time, protest groups joined together to remember them both. What were the outcomes, though? Well, not only did it raise awareness of the brutality that was being done in the name of the Vietnam War, but also it had cultural impacts, and we're going to consider one of those now. One of the most famous protest songs of the Vietnam War era was by the folk rock supergroup Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. It was called Ohio, and it was written by band member Neil Young, a Canadian by birth. These are some of the lyrics. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing them to you, I'm just going to read them as if they're poetry, but you can see the original LP cover here. Tin soldiers and Nixon's coming, we're finally on our own. This summer I hear the drumming, 4 dead in Ohio. Gotta get down to it, soldiers are cutting us down, should have been done long ago. What if you knew her and found her dead on the ground? How can you run when you know? These are powerful lyrics, and they do conjure up some of the shocking images from Kent State, but it also shows how music and protest became part of the counterculture against the war, and a crucial part of understanding opposition to the war, especially from young people. It's also a really good song, at least in my opinion. See if you can look it up and listen to a copy. It's worth bearing in mind that Neil Young wrote this in about half an hour on reading the newspaper article about the events at Kent State. Some final points then. Nixon's expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos, often after being elected promising to end it, was controversial. Students protested, particularly at Kent State University in Ohio. Disorder broke out among protesters, and the Officer Training Corps building on campus was burned down. On May the 4th, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed protesters. Alison Krauss, Jeffrey Miller, Sandra Schur, and William Knox Schroeder all died, 2 of them as bystanders not taking part in the protests. 9 others were wounded, including 1 man who was paralysed. The events and the iconic images of the massacre shocked the world and turned some people even further against the war. It is worth bearing in mind, though, that in a poll, the majority of Americans actually blamed the students for what happened. So as shocking as these events might be to look back at the time, it wasn't as clear-cut as that, and many people still supported the war. And remember the cultural impact as well. I really do urge you to look up Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young's Ohio. It's an iconic song of the era. That's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been interesting and useful to you. If it has, like the video and subscribe to the channel for more. If there's another topic that you're desperate for me to do a rapid revision video on, pop it in the comments below and I'll see what I can do. Or it might already be in one of the playlists. But for now, thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.